All right. Hello, fellow sapiens. Sit back, relax, and prepare to meet your ancestors. This is Sleepless Homo, soft science for quiet minds. We tell stories from deep time, slowly, calmly, from the bones beneath your feet to the stars above your head. No noise, no hype, just long, thoughtful walks through the ancient world. If you enjoy slow storytelling, the kind made for late-night thinkers, early risers, or quiet background hours, consider subscribing. It gently helps this find other wandering minds. Where do you listen from? In bed, earbuds in, at work, half-focused, or on a drive through the night, letting the ice age pass by your window? However you listen, you're part of a very human story. And if you drift off mid-episode, check the timestamps any time. These stories wait for you. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. What if I told you the world once shrank in on itself, not in size but in warmth, in moisture, in breath? Picture it, a landscape locked in place, windswept, grey and frozen. A planet whose pulse had slowed beneath kilometres of ice, its oceans drained into white silence, its warmth dimmed like a fire dying in its hearth. It is the late Upper Paleolithic, around 29,000 years before the present, and Earth, our shared restless home, has entered what we now call the Last Glacial Maximum. This wasn't just a cold winter or even a long century of chill. It was an era of planetary stillness. The northern continents were buried beneath titanic ice sheets, some reaching up to 3 kilometres thick. In North America, the Laurentide ice sheet sprawled across what would one day be Canada and the northern United States, sealing off entire ecosystems in white silence. Europe, too, was stilled beneath the Scandinavian and British ice sheets. The vast northern spine of Eurasia, from modern-day Germany to the edge of Siberia, lay under that same frozen ceiling. And with so much water locked away as ice, sea levels dropped, plummeted in fact, by more than 120 metres. Shorelines retreated into ghost maps. New lands emerged. Continents reached out to touch each other. Beringia was born. The shallow sea between Siberia and Alaska withdrew, revealing a vast cold steppe connecting the old world to the new. You could walk, if you dared, from Asia to the Americas. Sundaland too emerged, stitching together the Southeast Asian islands into a single tropical continent. And further west, the Persian Gulf evaporated into a vast arid plain. The Mediterranean's edges curled inward. The coasts of every landmass were redrawn, exposing plains now lost beneath today's oceans. The Earth was not smaller, but it felt smaller, less liquid, more still. But what did this frozen world feel like? Really feel like? The air was colder, yes, but it was also drier, thinner, sharper. Glacial winds carried dust across continents. In some places, dust storms blew with 20 to 25 times the intensity seen today. Fine particles lifted from permafrost and barren plains, blanketing the globe in a pale haze. It dimmed the sky, settled on snowfields, swirled around mammoth herds like spectral smoke. Even the sun seemed muted, filtered through layers of drifting silt. Imagine standing on an open plain in what is now Central Europe. To the north, the ice glows faintly on the horizon like a dying moon. To the south, steppe grasses ripple under a ceaseless wind, coated in pale dust. You smell no greenery, hear no bird call, only the crunch of frozen soil and the rasp of wind on rock. And yet the cold was not uniform. The Earth was a patchwork of extremes. Around the tropics, ecosystems retreated, compressing into narrow bands of survival. The West African rainforest withered, shrinking into small fragmented islands of greenery, surrounded by dry savanna. Southeast Asia's lush jungles thinned into open woodland. Even the Amazon shrank, retreating into dense cores hemmed in by spreading grassland. Central Africa, once rich with rivers and life, dried into deserts and cracked floodplains. The Sahara stretched wider than it does today. The Kalahari too expanded. Forests died, lakes evaporated. Yet even here, in this planetary exhale, some water remained, pooled in deep basins, fed by ice-fed rivers, protected by cliffs. These were the last green refuges, not lush, but livable. Across Asia, the lowest plains of northern China stood treeless and cold, a dust-choked wilderness swept by frigid wind. Steppe tundra spanned from Hungary to the Pacific. Reindeer, wild horse, saiga antelope and bison crossed it in migratory waves, trailing in the wake of ancient grazing routes. Farther north, permafrost bit deep into the ground, locking soil, water, and even ancient bones into eternal frost. Siberia, bleak and sprawling, was home to a strange paradox. One of the harshest environments, yet one of the richest in Pleistocene megafauna. Below the snow, in river valleys and grass pockets, life clung on. But perhaps the greatest illusion of this era lies not in the ice, but in the quiet. We call it an ice age, but it was equally a dust age, a wind age, an age of thirst. The atmospheric circulation patterns had shifted. With so much moisture trapped in frozen form, rain faltered. Cloud belts collapsed inward. Precipitation dwindled across most of the globe. Even the great monsoon systems were weaker, stuttering. Entire landscapes became deserts, not warm, rolling sand dunes, but cold deserts, bare, cracked soils under pale skies. The polar jet streams sagged southward. The tropics shriveled. Glaciers flowed, not just in the poles, but high in tropical mountains. Kilimanjaro, the Rwenzori, the Andes. Ice crowned them all, even as the plains below baked in drought. And what of the oceans? They too changed. Cooler surface temperatures altered currents, weakened the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, and disrupted heat transport across the hemispheres. The thermohaline engines sputtered. In the Southern Ocean, sea ice expanded seasonally, locking more carbon into deep circulation. The chemistry of the oceans shifted. Salinity, nutrient cycling, even pH, all changed in slow, sweeping rhythms. Coral reefs retreated. Continental shelves emerged, drying into salty flats. Entire marine ecosystems were displaced or disappeared. Ocean productivity waned in some areas and surged in others. It was not a global freeze, but a global rearrangement. No human would have seen the whole pattern, but step by step, mile by mile, they would have felt it. Every hunt lasted longer. Every migration was harder. Every water source more fragile. The world no longer offered abundance. It demanded adaptation. Yet for all the hardship, it is vital to remember. Life did not halt. Earth did not fall asleep. It simply changed shape. The great open plains, the mammoth steppe, were still rich with life. In fact, some ecologists believe this grassland ecosystem, stretching from Spain to Siberia to Alaska, may have been the most productive large mammal biome on Earth at the time. Wolves and cave lions tracked prey across its length. Snowy owls glided over ridgelines. Arctic foxes darted between rocks. The mammoths, of course, left the deepest footprints, but they were just one part of a teeming Ice Age chorus. And over it all, the ice loomed. Vast, white, and unmoving, the glaciers seemed eternal. But even they were not static. They flowed slowly, like stone-made liquid, carving valleys and dragging boulders, pressing down the land beneath their weight. In Canada and Scandinavia, the crust of the earth literally sank. In the silence of that pressure, new lakes and basins formed, sculpted under kilometres of ice. When the melt came, long after this moment, it would fill those scars with water, birthing the modern world's lakes and rivers. But for now the water slept. From space, had we looked down, had we had such eyes, we would have seen a colder, dimmer planet, a world veiled in haze, blue less vibrant, green less frequent. A planet paused, not dead, but narrowed. And from this narrowing came focus. Every creature, every biome, every gust of wind was part of an ancient equilibrium, fragile, fierce, and fleeting. This is what the world looked like 29,000 years ago. A time before myth, before names, but not before stories. Because in the frozen hollows of that world, life still moved, still adapted, still endured. And though no one can say with certainty what the sky sounded like under that high glacial wind, or how long a mammoth herd's shadow stretched at dusk, we do know this: Earth was colder, drier, and sharper than anything we have known since. And it still carried the heartbeat of every future that would follow. We don't know all the details, of course. No one does. The ice has erased as much as it has preserved. But from sediment layers, ancient pollen, glacial cores and buried coastlines, the picture grows clearer every year. This is simply what the stones suggest. And even now those stones still whisper across the long wind. What if I told you that 28,000 years ago, in a world quieter and colder than anything we've ever known, there were families, people like you, sitting beside fires in the snow, roasting meat beneath a ceiling of stitched hides, while the wind howled through the bones of mammoths, that they knew what to wear, what to hunt, and what to share to keep each other alive, and that some of what they built is still buried beneath the frost today? We tend to think of deep prehistory as empty, a flat line of nothing between dramatic inventions. But the truth is, it was full of answers, and few periods are more impressive, more intricately human than the hard middle of the Last Glacial Maximum. Around 28,000 years ago, in the thick of the cold, Homo sapiens were not just surviving, they were solving. Here, at the edges of the great ice sheets, humans lived not by chance, but by knowledge. You can picture them now, small groups tucked into river valleys or huddled at the mouth of a cave, their backs to the wind, their children bundled in furs. The sky is iron grey, the soil frozen, the land offers no warmth. And yet these people endure, not only because of their tools, but because of their minds. Clothing was no longer a luxury, it was engineering. Archaeological finds from across glacial Eurasia, particularly in Eastern Europe and parts of Siberia, point to the use of bone needles with bored-out eyes, small, perfectly shaped, and ideal for threading sinew through hide. These are not rough implements. They're delicate, specific, and widespread, telling us that sewing was common, even essential. Without layered clothing stitched from reindeer hair or mammoth hide, frostbite would have ended many lives. But more than function, these garments tell a story of care. Sewing takes time. It means preparation. It means someone watching over a child's hood, or patching a parka for an elder too frail to hunt. Shelter, too, shows a surprising level of foresight. In Ukraine and parts of southern Russia, circular structures made from mammoth bones have been uncovered, dating to between 25,000 and 30,000 years ago, 22,000 years ago. These are not mere windbreaks. They are domed huts, arranged with ribs and skulls, tusks and femurs, their walls possibly covered with hides or turf. Entrances are aligned with the prevailing winds, hearths sit at the centre. Archaeologists have even found storage pits and signs of repeated use. Some of these Ice Age dwellings were over 4 meters in diameter. Imagine the knowledge it takes to build a structure from the skeleton of a 30-ton animal. Not just the muscle, but the method. This is architecture born of deep adaptation, and it wasn't limited to the mammoth steppe. In places without large bones, people built with what they had. Wooden frames, packed earth, even snow itself. Inside, life continued with quiet rhythm. A day might begin with a foraging walk, eyes peeled for rabbit trails or fresh caribou dung. At midday, a trio of hunters might return with game, bones already stripped in the field to save weight. Flint is napped carefully by the hearthlight. Long, slender blades, burins for carving, scrapers for hide work. Children watch their elders' hands, learning with every cut. Fat is rendered. Marrow sucked from the split femur of an aurochs. Water is melted from snow, filtered through moss, warmed in a skin pouch hung close to the coals. This is not chaos, it's craft. Their tools reflect that craft. The Gravettian people, active across Europe at this time, carried versatile kits, stone points for hunting, antler-tine harpoons for fishing in ice-choked rivers, awls and burins shaped from bone. These weren't standardized, mass-produced objects. They were tuned to the hand, to the task, to the terrain, and each one told a story of how these groups read the land. In one region, you might see more backed blades, a response to game that runs. In another, thicker scrapers for reindeer hide, perhaps used to make winter boots or baby slings. Even the fire pits show care. Arrange stones to reflect heat inward. Ash shoveled to insulate meat while it slow roasts. Smoke managed with cracks in the ceiling or low vents dug into the snowpack. But it wasn't just survival by tools, it was survival by others. These were social species, our species, defined not by strength, but by interdependence. Archaeological sites from this era often show signs of care for the injured and elderly. Individuals with skeletal damage that would have made walking impossible appear to have lived for years after injury. Someone must have helped them hunt or brought them food. Fire must have been kept lit in their shelter, and not just for warmth. Fire was their timekeeper, their centre. Around it stories were told, not as myth yet, but perhaps as memory. Where to find the caribou in spring? Where the river bends freeze late? What to eat when the game grows lean? Language by this point was likely rich, layered, and fully modern. Though we have no direct record of words, the complexity of their social bonds, the planning of their hunts, and the delicacy of their tools imply a deep capacity for communication. Some words may have passed down, changed beyond recognition, still flickering in the syllables we speak today. But even without a single recorded phrase, the evidence of language is in every structure, every burial, every tool passed hand to hand across generations. And across the glacial plain, others watched. Wolves, circling camps for scraps, may have first been tolerated here, perhaps even befriended. Though true domestication likely came later, the earlier steps toward partnership between humans and canids might have begun in cold like this. The shared fire, the shared meat, the shared threat of dark. Still, none of this came easily. For every fire-lit home there were likely many lost. The cold claimed what it could. Malnutrition was common, infant mortality high. But what's astonishing is not that some died, it's that many did not. Through cooperation, planning, and innovation, our species weathered the deep freeze, not just in numbers, but in spirit. And they did it without metal, without writing, without cities. They did it with memory, with hands, with trust. We can't name them, not yet. No kings or queens among them. No stone monuments etched with lineage, just footprints, charred bones, hollowed antlers, a scattering of pierced shells, perhaps worn as decoration, a hearthstone blackened by long use, and scattered through the loess and silt, a record not of conquest but of continuity. These are not myths, they are data. Interpreted, yes, always cautiously, always subject to revision. But in the absence of names, we still have the evidence of their decisions. They move deliberately, they shape their lives around cycles of migration, around wind and ice, around the tools they knew they'd need before the season turned. That's not just survival, that's strategy, that's culture. So the next time you feel the cold settle in your bones, on a long night or a snowy day, remember, our species has been here before, in smaller numbers, with fewer words, but with minds just as sharp, and fires just as warm. And while we don't yet know all the details, no scientist worth trusting ever claims certainty where the record is partial, we know this much. In the silence between glaciers, humans endured. They adapted. They made homes out of bones, clothes out of sinew, memories out of survival. And in doing so, they kept the future alive. What if I told you that even at the coldest edge of the Ice Age, when the wind could flay the skin from your face and every fire felt borrowed from the gods, humans still carved beauty out of bone? That while glaciers howled and herds moved south, some of our ancestors stayed behind to paint the walls of darkness itself, not for food, not for warmth, but for meaning. 27,000 years ago, art was not luxury. It was survival of a different kind. Picture it. A limestone cave in what we now call Austria, the air thick with the smell of burning pine resin. A small group gathers around a flickering fire, its light bouncing off uneven stone. A woman crouches near the glow, her hands coated in ochre, fingers red to the wrist. In her lap lies a small piece of limestone no longer than her palm. With deliberate rhythmic pressure, she scrapes its surface using a flint flake. The sound is soft, steady. The shape she coaxes into being has no face, no feet, just swelling curves, a rounded belly, heavy breasts, broad hips. She isn't sculpting a portrait, she's sculpting an idea. The figurine, which we today call the Venus of Willendorf, will be found thousands of centuries later, its limestone surface still holding traces of ochre, still whispering of its maker's world. It is among the oldest known expressions of symbolic art, dated to roughly between 28 and 25,000 years before our time. But this figurine isn't alone. Dozens more like it have been found from France to Russia, part of what archaeologists call the Gravettian tradition, a shared artistic language that spread across Ice Age Europe. Each Venus is unique, but the theme repeats: faceless, round, tactile. They fit perfectly into a closed hand, as if meant to be held during storytelling, childbirth, or ritual. No one knows for certain what they meant. Some see fertility idols, others symbols of abundance or protection in a world of scarcity. A few researchers suggest they were self-portraits of women looking down at their own bodies. The truth, as always, hides in the silence of time. Yet the consistency of their form, the same exaggerations, the same choice of materials, suggest these weren't random works. They were intentional. And that intention tells us something profound. It tells us that even in an age defined by struggle, people created symbols to make sense of it. They looked at the cycles of birth, hunger, death, and return, and sought to give them shape. The caves, too, hold stories of this inner world. Some of the most evocative prehistoric art known to us comes from roughly this era, preserved in the limestone chambers of Europe. Imagine a small group entering a cave with torches made of pine wood or juniper. The light flickers across rock walls that glisten with moisture. One person grinds ochre and manganese oxide into powder, mixing it with animal fat to make paint. Another holds a torch near the surface, the shadows rippling over the uneven contours of stone. A third reaches out and presses their hand against the wall. When they lift it away, the silhouette remains, a ghost of presence, a statement that says, "I was here." These handprints, found in sites across France and Spain, and extending eastward through Central Europe, are among humanity's earlier signatures. Some are layered with animal shapes: bison, mammoth, horse, ibex, drawn not for the hunt, but for something more elusive. Were they depictions of power, memories of migration, offerings to whatever the Ice Age night held beyond the firelight? We can't say. But the very act of painting in darkness, deep in places where no sunlight ever reached, suggests these people were exploring more than the physical world. They were mapping the unseen. What's remarkable is not just that they made art, but how they made it. Pigments came from the earth itself, ochre dug from clay-rich deposits, charcoal ground from burned wood, black manganese scraped from stone. They mixed them with animal fat or water, applied them with brushes made from chewed sticks, feathers, or even fingertips. Engravings were carved with precision into bone or antler. Some pieces were small enough to be carried, others monumental, spanning meters of cave wall. Every stroke required both knowledge and patience, and a measure of reverence. In this frozen world, art was the opposite of waste. It was investment. Each figurine, each painting, each engraved tool reinforced identity, memory, belonging. The cold outside could take everything but meaning, so they built meaning with their hands. Archaeology gives us glimpses of these lives not only through their art, but also through how they buried their dead. At sites in Central and Eastern Europe, burials from around this time show extraordinary care. The Sunghir site, for instance, though a few thousand years older, set a pattern that endured. Two children laid side by side, their small bodies covered in red ochre, adorned with ivory beads that would have taken hundreds of hours to make. Around 27,000 years ago, similar traditions continued. Graves include ornaments, animal teeth pendants, tools and pigments, objects that suggest both remembrance and hope. To decorate the dead is to believe in something beyond the moment of loss. It is to say, you still matter. And here lies one of the quiet paradoxes of Ice Age life. The world outside demanded constant vigilance, yet inside these caves, amid the flicker of light and colour, humans dared to stop, to think, to imagine. That is not instinct. That is consciousness at work. When we look at these creations now, the Venus figurines, the ochre handprints, the carved bones, it's easy to mistake them for isolated wonders, sparks of genius scattered through a dark age. But together, they tell a continuous story of cognitive modernity. They show that by 27,000 years ago, humans were not just anatomically modern, but emotionally and symbolically modern. They could project ideas into objects, transform raw material into metaphor. They were, in every way that matters, us. The caves themselves became temples of time. The deeper you went, the further you travelled, not only from daylight, but from ordinary experience. These were places where stories took shape, where fears were painted into beasts, where hope was carved into stone. The practice of going underground to express wonder or fear would echo through every civilization that followed, from catacombs to cathedrals. We can almost sense its beginning here, under the ice. One can imagine a night near the cave mouth when a group gathers to watch the flames dance. Someone holds up a carved figurine, its surface glimmering red in the firelight. The group falls silent. Perhaps a tale is told, of the first mother, or the return of the reindeer, or the spirit of the hunt. The line between art and belief blurs. For them, this sacred and the practical were never separate. A painted bison was both symbol and sustenance, prayer and plan. Even their personal adornments speak of meaning carried close. Perforated shells, fox teeth, tiny bones strung into necklaces, these objects moved with their owners, worn into every migration. They were portable memories, perhaps marks of belonging to a band or lineage. A child might inherit a bead worn by a grandparent. A traveller might wear the tooth of an animal they'd hunted. A quiet acknowledgement of the life taken and the life sustained. In these details lies the soul of Ice Age art. It wasn't made to last, it was made to connect. To one another, to ancestors, to the unseen. And though we cannot translate their silence, we can recognise the gesture. Hands shaping what words could not yet fix. The more we study these sites, the more we realise how complex their symbolic worlds were. Cave acoustic studies, for example, have shown that many painted chambers correspond to areas of high echo or resonance, suggesting the sound itself may have been part of the experience. The flicker of torchlight, the hum of voices, the sound of wind moving through tunnels, all merging into ceremony. These weren't galleries, they were theatres of existence. It is humbling, truly, to think that in an age of ice, art may have been one of humanity's warmest inventions. The need to make something beautiful, to mark meaning into matter, runs deeper than comfort. It's a survival instinct of the mind. Because when you're surrounded by darkness, sometimes the only way to stay human is to create light. We don't know every motive or ritual that shaped these works, and we likely never will. Archaeology is a conversation with absence. But what we do know, what the bones and pigments and carvings whisper, is that even 27 millennia ago, our species had already crossed an invisible threshold. We were no longer just surviving. We were remembering, imagining, hoping. Somewhere in a cave now sealed by time, an ancient hand left its mark on stone. The ice advanced, the fires went out, but that handprint remains. A small, silent reminder that in the coldest night the world has ever known, something inside us refused to freeze. Imagine this. You wake to the sound of the earth itself breathing, slow, heavy, and alive. Mist rises from a plain of frozen grass, each blade rimmed with frost, each shadow long and pale under a low sun. In the distance, something moves, something enormous. A shape first, then sound. The crunch of snow beneath pillars of bone and muscle. A woolly mammoth, the size of a bus, trudges through the mist, its shaggy coat streaming in the wind like a dark flag of survival. Beside it, a smaller calf keeps pace, its breath a cloud in the cold air. Behind them more, a herd, ancient and deliberate, moving along paths worn into the permafrost by centuries of feet that would never know cities or names. 26,000 years ago, this was not a barren world. It was an empire of giants. The frozen plains of the Pleistocene were not empty wastelands as we often imagine them. They were crowded with life. The mammoth steppe, stretching from France to Siberia, was one of the richest ecosystems in Earth's history. And in this land of cold sunlight, humans were not the only experiment in endurance. All around them walked creatures of impossible scale and quiet majesty. Some familiar, some utterly alien. The mammoth, of course, stands at the centre of that world. The woolly species, Mammuthus primigenius, was perfectly engineered for cold. A double-layered coat, an outer sea of shaggy brown hair and a dense insulating underfur, kept it warm even in blizzards. Beneath that, thick skin, then a cushion of fat up to 10 centimetres deep. Its ears were small, its tail shorter still, both minimising heat loss. Its tusks, sometimes longer than a man's height, curved forward in wide arcs used to sweep snow aside in search of the grasses hidden beneath. They ate constantly, needing hundreds of pounds of vegetation each day to sustain their 6-ton bulk. Fossilised dung found in Siberian permafrost still carries pollen from the flowers they ate. The ground remembers their meals, but mammoths were not alone, not even close. The steppe was also home to the woolly rhinoceros, Quilodonta antiquitatis, a stocky beast covered in a coarse reddish coat. Its massive horn, sometimes over a metre long, wasn't just a weapon. The front edge is flattened, polished smooth by a lifetime of scraping snow to uncover grass. Its body shows adaptations as precise as any engineered machine. Short legs, hump of muscle for the neck, thick skin folded against the cold. These rhinoceroses were common from France to Mongolia. Some were still walking across the plains when early humans painted them on cave walls. To the west, great herds of steppe bison roamed, ancestors of modern cattle, but larger, more rugged, with horns spanning a metre across. They moved like living storms, their hooves shaking the ground, their breath steaming in great white clouds. Where they grazed, the grass stayed short and new growth sprouted. Their presence shaped the steppe itself, a living feedback loop of energy and frost. Among them, wild horses, smaller than the domestic breeds that would come later, with thick necks and compact bodies. They dug through snow with their hooves, scraping to reach frozen sedge and wild barley. And towering above all stood the Irish elk, Megaloceros giganteus, the largest deer that ever lived. The males carried antlers spanning nearly 4 metres, wider than a modern car. They were not truly elk, but giant deer, and their antlers, while beautiful, were both weapon and burden. Their fossils show massive neck muscles developed to carry that weight. In the low light of an Ice Age dawn, a herd of them would have glowed golden, their antlers catching the first rays of sun like a forest of moving branches. Predators stalked this frozen garden. The cave lion, Panthera spelaea, roamed from Europe to Siberia, larger than any modern lion, with males possibly lacking manes to better conserve heat. They hunted in groups, ambushing horses and reindeer on open ground, sometimes entering caves where humans also sheltered. Their bones appear side by side with ours in some sites, evidence of competition or perhaps caution. Even more formidable were the scimitar-toothed cats, their long curved canines adapted for slicing flesh, not crushing bone. And then there were the wolves, lean, shaggy, intelligent. By this time some may have already begun lingering near human camps, drawn by scraps, their behaviour shifting ever so slightly toward curiosity rather than fear. These first encounters, quiet, cautious, would one day evolve into one of the most profound partnerships on Earth. But for now, the line between prey, predator and companion remained uncertain. Humans were small among these giants, but not powerless. Archaeological evidence shows that we hunted some of them, though sparingly and strategically. Mammoth kill sites in places like Dolny Vestonish and Mezhirich in Eastern Europe reveal bones cut cleanly with stone blades, marrow extracted with practiced precision. Some of the same bones were later used to build homes, stacked into circles and covered with hides, both shelter and monument. At other sites, stone spear points are found embedded in ribs, the marks of hunts that must have taken days of planning. To face an adult mammoth or bison required more than courage. It required coordination, patience, and probably a good plan to run the other way if things went wrong. These were not reckless confrontations. They were calculated acts of survival. Humans may have driven herds into natural traps, steep ravines or icy bogs, where the animals could be killed more easily. Evidence from footprints and hunting debris suggests cooperation, even choreography. Individuals working in sequence, one flushing, another ambushing, others preparing fire pits for meat processing. It is tempting to see in these hunts the roots of our social instinct, shared risk, shared reward. But hunting wasn't the only relationship we had with these giants. Many seem to have inspired awe. Cave engravings from across Europe show mammoths and rhinoceroses rendered not as trophies but as presences. Vast, deliberate lines etched into stone. The animals are shown in motion, their forms exaggerated, their scale immense beside human figures. This suggests reverence, perhaps even fear. It's possible that in the rhythm of their migrations, people saw something divine. Beings who could survive the cold that nearly killed us, who seemed born from the snow itself. Every trace of these animals we uncover tells us more about the Ice Age world we once shared. In the frozen soil of Siberia, whole mammoths have been found with skin, muscle, and even stomach contents intact. Some still have grass in their mouths, frozen in mid-chew. In the caves of southern France, preserved bones bear cut marks, thin, precise, unambiguous, showing that humans butchered carcasses with practiced efficiency. In one famous Ukrainian site, archaeologists discovered not only mammoth bones used for housing, but decorations carved into ivory, as if the hunters who built those shelters also honoured the animals that provided them. The steppe itself was an ecosystem of movement. Mammoths trampled trails that other species followed. Their dung nourished hardy plants. The death of one animal fed wolves, ravens, and foxes. Even now, pollen records from ancient sediments reveal the ripple effect of their presence. When megafauna populations declined in later millennia, grasslands changed composition, giving way to tundra mosses. The giants were gardeners of the Ice Age, shaping entire biomes by simply existing. For the humans walking among them, life was lived in the shadow of scale. To stand on that step was to be reminded that the world was not ours alone. The sounds of it, the trumpeting of mammoths, the bellowing of bison, the hiss of snow under massive feet, formed a constant background hum to existence. And yet, within that grandeur, people found ways to adapt. Spears grew stronger, projectiles lighter, strategies smarter. The balance between fear and necessity became artful, deliberate. It's humbling to think of our ancestors standing so small in that vast field of giants, their fires barely visible from a distance, their lives fragile threads in a tapestry of beasts that no longer walk the earth. But in their coexistence with those animals lies a truth we often forget. Humanity didn't rise in isolation. We were shaped by everything that shared our world. The herds we followed, the predators we feared, the titans we learned to understand. One can imagine an Ice Age hunter pausing at dawn, watching a mammoth herd pass, his spear at his side. He doesn't throw it. Not yet. For a moment, he simply watches. Steam curls from his breath, mingling with theirs. Two species, ancient and aware, measuring each other in silence. The mammoth turns its head, dark eyes catching the light, and then, slowly, it moves on. We may never know all the details of that world, the cadence of its migrations, the colour of its sunsets, the texture of its cold, but we can still feel its echo. In every elephant that rumbles across the savannah, in every bison pawing the prairie, a fragment of the Pleistocene endures. The giants may be gone, but the memory of walking beside them is written into our bones. What if I told you that while Europe lay locked under kilometres of ice, other corners of the planet were whispering a different story? That while glaciers groaned across Scandinavia and mammoths trudged through Siberia's twilight, in the tropical heart of Thailand a child was being laid to rest in a dry cave surrounded by the hum of insects and the fading echo of rain? The Ice Age was not one single frostbitten world. It was a mosaic, a patchwork of extremes where cold was only one of many struggles. 25,000 years ago, Earth was fractured by climate but alive with adaptation. Let's start far from the familiar in Southeast Asia. Here, the glaciers never came. The jungles that today steam with orchids and macaques were then shrinking, their moisture drawn northward by global cooling. The Last Glacial Maximum turned this green belt into a quilt of open woodlands and dry savannas. Palms retreated, grasses advanced, rivers ran slower and narrower. Yet in these parched forests people endured. They hunted small deer, pigs, and monitor lizards, and they gathered seeds and tubers from the sparse soil. In a limestone cave in western Thailand, scientists recently uncovered a clue to just how far humanity's reach extended, even in this altered landscape: Tam Din Cave. The find was small, fragile, and impossibly moving. The skeleton of a child, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, lay gently in the dust more than 29,000 years ago. Around the bones were simple stone flakes, tools of a people who lived by patience and pattern. Traces of red pigment hinted at ritual, or perhaps at nothing more than care. Above the burial site, faint rock art lingers, ochre figures, worn but persistent, painted by hands that once carried fire into the dark. Announced in 2025, this discovery confirmed what many had suspected, that even in the tropics, where the air was heavy with dryness rather than ice, humans adapted. They learned new rhythms for a cooler, harder world. Across the Sunda Shelf, where today's islands of Borneo, Sumatra and Java stand isolated by sea, the Ice Age exposed an immense landmass, Sundaland, binding them into a single continent. The coast stretched hundreds of kilometres farther than it does now. Dense rainforests gave way to open savanna, with rivers meandering across plains now drowned beneath the South China Sea. These were not empty lands. Fossil pollen shows humans and animals alike thriving in these new ecosystems. Cave sites from Vietnam to Indonesia hold charcoal from ancient hearths, bones of deer and boar, even shell beads worn as ornaments. To live here was to master scarcity, to know where water hid in the dry months, when to follow the monsoon's edge, and how to keep fire alive when the forest no longer sheltered it. Farther north, the picture shifts again. In East Asia, northern China's vast Loess plains were not jungles but frozen grasslands, dusted with silt carried by the relentless glacial winds. Trees were rare, rivers shallow, winters brutal. Here, small groups of hunters followed herds of wild horses, gazelles and deer, adapting to a rhythm of hunger and wind. Stone tools from these regions show astonishing refinement. Long blades shaped with pressure flaking, and small backed points that hint at early projectiles. In such barren country, survival meant speed, not just of hand, but of thought. Beyond the plains in the far northeast, the people of the Yana River in Arctic Russia lived at what seems like the edge of possibility. Their site, Yana RHS, lies well within the Arctic Circle, and yet it dates to roughly this same period. Here, in temperatures that would freeze breath mid-air, humans made camp, crafted tools of mammoth ivory, and hunted reindeer and bison along the icy rivers. Their dwellings, inferred from post holes and hearths, were circular, insulated with hides and perhaps snow. They wore beads carved from fox teeth and small pendants of ivory, signs not only of endurance, but of self-expression. To live at 70 degrees north during the coldest stretch of the Pleistocene defies imagination, yet they did. They not only survived, they thrived. Shift now to the other side of the world, Africa, the first home of our species. Though the equator still glowed with sun, even here the Ice Age had teeth. Without the northern monsoons to draw moisture inland, the great deserts grew monstrous. The Sahara ballooned southward, swallowing grasslands and river valleys. The Kalahari too expanded, turning savanna into sand. What water remained gathered in scattered basins and uplands, refuges where life held on like green islands in a sea of dust. In these African refuges, small bands of humans adapted in ingenious ways. Along the edges of ancient megalakes, like those that once filled the basins of today's Chad and Niger, people fished and collected shellfish, their middens leaving trails of broken mollusk shells across the ancient shorelines. In southern Africa's fynbos, the scrubby, diverse vegetation at the continent's tip, they gathered roots and seeds rich in carbohydrates. Archaeological finds from this time show a continuity of stone traditions, small-backed microliths suited for composite tools. Life did not stop in the dry centuries, it reorganized. Even the mountains of Africa wore their own fleeting crowns of ice. The peaks of Kilimanjaro, Mount Kenya, and the Rwenzori Range held glaciers during this era, their meltwaters feeding the valleys below. And in those valleys, people stayed close to the streams, hunting antelope and ostrich, keeping their distance from the growing deserts to the north. These refuges may have served as reservoirs of genetic diversity, pockets from which humans would later re-expand once the climate softened. If we cross westward again to the Americas, though humans there remain a debated presence at this exact time, we can imagine similar contrasts. The lowlands of what would one day be the Amazon were cooler and drier, fragmented into savannas bordered by forest refuges. In North America, the ice sheets ruled the north, but farther south the plains bloomed with life, bison, camel and horse, awaiting the first humans who would reach them millennia later. What emerges from all these landscapes is a single truth. The Ice Age was not a single season of suffering spread evenly across Earth. It was an orchestra of climates, each playing a different note. Cold in the north, dry in the tropics, wind-scorched in the deserts, wet and temperate only in rare corridors, those pockets of refuge where the human story caught its breath. In Southeast Asia, survival meant enduring drought. In Siberia, it meant resisting the cold. In Africa, it meant outrunning the desert. Yet everywhere, the solution was the same: adaptation. Not in our bodies, but in our minds. The same creativity that sculpted ivory beads in the Arctic carved fishhooks beside tropical rivers. The same cooperation that built mammoth-bone huts in the steppe helped gather tubers in the fynbos. The form of the struggle changed, the essence of humanity did not. The Tam Din child in Thailand, the hunters of Yana, the fisher-folk of ancient Africa, they were all solving the same puzzle: how to be alive when the planet seems determined to test you. And their answers, though separated by continents, echo one another. They used fire, tools, community, and knowledge. The same quiet tools that still carry us now. It's tempting to see the Last Glacial Maximum as a singular catastrophe, a time of universal frost. But the evidence paints a subtler picture. In some regions, life contracted into narrow refuges. In others, it simply changed shape. The world's ecosystems were rewritten, but not erased. Rainforests became savannas, lakes became dunes, and even the sea itself withdrew, exposing new lands like Sundaland and the Bringian Plains. fresh bridges of future migrations. For every place frozen, another was revealed. We can imagine a world map drawn 25,000 years ago, if any hand had existed to draw it. The poles were vast and white, yes, but the equator was brown and cracked, the continents stretched and reconnected. It was an earth half hidden under its own breath, yet still pulsing with movement. Standing somewhere in that world, whether under the tropical stars of Southeast Asia, beside an African riverbed, or on the frozen tundra of Siberia, a human could look up and see the same constellations we see today, the same moon, the same questions about what lies beyond survival, and that shared sky reminds us, no matter the latitude or the temperature, all these lives were threads in the same vast experiment. The Ice Age was never a single story told in frost. It was 1,000 smaller stories told in adaptation, in endurance, and in the stubborn refusal of life to stop moving forward. And though the world's edges were divided by ice and sand, the minds that lived through it were bound by something universal, a quiet, human determination to make the unlivable livable. Imagine this. The world has fallen silent. The seas have withdrawn, the rivers slowed to threads of ice, and the wind carries the taste of dust across continents. It is 24,000 years ago. The coldest point Earth has known in the last 100 millennia. The last glacial maximum. Glaciers have spread to their greatest reach, sealing a quarter of the planet beneath mountains of frozen water. Average global temperatures have plunged roughly 6 degrees below those we live in now. Over land, the drop is even more brutal, in some places 15 or 20 degrees colder. The air is thin with moisture. Rain has nearly vanished. Across Asia, winds sweep up dust from the bare deserts of Mongolia and northern China, scattering it thousands of kilometres across the globe. A planet wrapped in ice, and yet still breathing. To stand in that time would have been to witness a kind of stillness we can hardly imagine. Every sound softened by snow, every horizon sharp with light. In northern Europe, the ice cap smothers the land from the British Isles to the Ural Mountains. Scandinavia is nothing but a wall of white stretching beyond sight. The Alps vanish beneath kilometres of glacier. The North American ice sheets merge from coast to coast, locking up so much water that global sea levels fall over 100 metres. Shorelines stretch far into what is now open sea, exposing vast plains where islands will one day rise. The world's oceans shrink, continents grow. It is as if Earth itself has inhaled and forgotten to exhale. The skies above this frozen Earth are heavy with dust rather than clouds. From the ice cores of Antarctica and Greenland, we now know that these years were the driest of the Pleistocene. Layers of wind-blown particles, dust from the Gobi, volcanic ash, microscopic traces of pollen, form an annual record of a planet in drought. In some samples, the dust levels spike 20 times higher than modern ones, each layer a whisper of a parched and restless world. Ocean sediments tell the same story. Even the seas were lean, with plankton populations collapsing under the cold. And yet, even in this desolation, life endured. In the far south of Europe, between the ice sheet and the Mediterranean, narrow corridors of survival remained. Southern France, northern Spain, and parts of Italy became refugees, tiny green veins running through the white. Here, in cave-rich valleys sheltered from the worst of the wind, human families huddled around hearths that never went out. Archaeologists find their signatures in the layers of these caves: bone needles for stitching layered hides, beads made from shell and ivory, fragments of pigment where someone once ground ochre by firelight. The evidence shows continuity, no great break in occupation, meaning that through all the storms humans stayed. Picture the entrance of one of those caves in winter. The wind outside howls through the gorge, blowing curtains of snow into the dark. Inside, the air smells of smoke and fat. A fire flickers low. A mother mends a fur hood using sinew thread and a needle carved from reindeer bone. Her child, half asleep, toys with a string of beads. In the dim light, the walls glimmer faintly, scratched with mammoth shapes and red handprints. They do not decorate, they endure. These caves are not only shelters, they are repositories of memory. Far to the east, in southern Siberia, the same species, Homo sapiens, faces a different form of the same ordeal. Around the shores of Lake Baikal, the site of Malta tells us of a people who refuse to yield to the cold. Here archaeologists find hearths blackened by repeated use, animal bones split for marrow, and small carvings made from mammoth ivory. The campfires burned against temperatures that could drop below 40 degrees Celsius. Their diet was simple but precise. Meat and fat from reindeer, bison and mammoth, augmented by fish pulled from ice-bound rivers. The evidence of survival here is astonishing. Children's footprints frozen into the ancient soil, charred bones marked with cut lines that show practiced butchery. Even in the deepest cold, the rhythm of life persisted. Perhaps the most haunting discovery of this frozen century lies at Kostenki, on the plains of what is now western Russia. There, beneath meters of loess, archaeologists uncovered something extraordinary. A circular structure 12 meters across, made entirely of mammoth bones, the skulls, tusks, ribs and femurs of 60 individual animals. Some are stacked, others fitted like puzzle pieces, forming a ring that would have sheltered humans from the relentless wind. Radiocarbon dating places it around 25,000 years ago, right in the heart of the Last Glacial Maximum. The scale alone defies imagination. Who built it? How long did it take to gather the bones? Were the mammoths hunted or scavenged from the frozen dead? No one knows for certain. But what is clear is that it was not random. This was architecture, deliberate, laborious, communal. The ring may have supported a roof of hides. Inside, traces of hearths and burned bones suggest cooking, heating, maybe even ritual. Around its perimeter, small pits filled with debris may have stored food or tools. It stands as both monument and mystery, a fossil of human ingenuity at the coldest edge of possibility. It is humbling to realize that such a structure was not unique. Across the plains of Eastern Europe, similar rings appear, each one a testament to a shared solution. When the earth turned unlivable, build from the bones of those who survived it longer. The cold's grip was not limited to humans. Animals, too, pushed their limits. Reindeer migrated south in vast herds, following strips of tundra that still grew lichen through the frost. Wolves shadowed them, lean and cautious. Steppe bison and horses scavenged the frozen grass, their breath crystallizing in the air. Many species adapted in ways that now seem almost supernatural. Thicker coats, smaller extremities, shorter life cycles. The mammoths, once spread across continents, began to cluster in the few remaining regions where food could still be found. The steppe corridors between the glaciers. Even the predators grew careful. The cave lions and hyenas retreated from the coldest zones, surviving where the herd still grazed. For many, this balance could not last forever. But for this brief, frozen moment, the world still functioned. From the perspective of deep time, the last glacial maximum was not a pause but a test, a stress point that squeezed every species to its limit. What survived did so through adaptation, not strength. Humans, unlike mammoths, did not grow thicker fur. We grew memory, skill, and cooperation. In Europe's refugees and Siberia's camps, people shared knowledge: how to make clothing, how to trap animals, how to build windbreaks of bone and snow. Some scientists think these were the years when our species refined its sense of community most sharply, when survival depended less on the individual and more on the collective. It is easy to imagine this world as endless night, but even here, beauty persisted. The low Arctic sun painted the glaciers in pink and gold. Auroras shimmered across the dark skies, rippling over the ice like slow lightning. And somewhere, in a cave in southern France, a child pressed a handprint against the wall in ochre red, a gesture of being alive, still here, even as the cold consumed everything else. Modern science gives us glimpses of what that world truly felt like. From Antarctic ice cores, we know that carbon dioxide levels had fallen to less than 200 parts per million, the lowest concentration of the past 800,000 years. The air was thinner, colder, drier. From Greenland's cores, we can read each snowfall as a line of history, compressed over millennia. The isotopes in those layers show the depth of the chill. Average winter temperatures across the north dropped by 20 or more degrees. Dust levels soared. Volcanic ash mingled with mineral grains from Asia, carried halfway across the planet by ferocious winds. These are not abstract numbers. They're fingerprints of the climate's cruelty. And yet, in the same record, we find continuity. The cores do not show extinction. They show endurance. Microscopic traces of pollen, algae and soot, faint but present, prove that life never gave up entirely. Even when global ecosystems shrank to a fraction of their former size, the pulse of photosynthesis, of fire, of animal breath never stopped. For those who lived through it, the world must have felt eternal in its frozen stillness. But in hindsight, this was only the planet's exhale before the thaw. Within a few millennia, the ice would begin to retreat, rivers would awaken, and grasslands would bloom again. They could not know that yet. For now they tended fires in darkness, listened to the wind tear through the valleys, and waited. Somewhere in that frozen silence, a group of humans sat inside their mammoth-bone shelter. Outside, the snow drifted over the plain, muffling every sound. Inside, the air shimmered with the heat of the fire, the smell of smoke and fat, the quiet murmur of voices. Someone fed the flames, someone sharpened a flint, someone dreamed. The cold pressed close but did not enter, and that, perhaps more than any artifact or fossil, is the measure of this moment, the refusal to vanish. In a universe of extremes, life endured by learning to endure itself. That is the story written in every ash layer and every handprint left beneath the ice. What if I told you that in the middle of the Ice Age, when mammoths still drank from frozen lakes and the northern half of the world slept under ice, someone walked barefoot across a muddy lakeshore in what is now New Mexico? That their footprints, those soft, fleeting impressions in wet sand, would survive for 23,000 years, only to whisper to us across time, "We were here long before you thought we could be." The story begins not with bones or tools, but with something far more delicate: footprints. In the dry heart of White Sands National Park, where shimmering dunes stretch across the desert, lies a vanished lake bed known as Lake Otero. Once, during the last glacial maximum, this basin held shallow water and seasonal marshes, an oasis in an Ice Age desert. Today it's a landscape of gypsum sand and salt crust, dazzling white under the sun. But beneath that surface, layered like pages of a book, are traces of another world. In 2021, a team of researchers from the US Geological Survey and other institutions made an announcement that rippled through archaeology like a seismic shock. Embedded in the ancient sediment of Lake Otero, they found human footprints, dozens of them, pressed alongside the tracks of Ice Age animals. Not impressions of hunters or artists, but of ordinary walkers, teenagers, children, perhaps families moving along the edge of water. Their steps were small, direct, confident. You could follow their trail as if they had passed by only hours ago. At first, the discovery seemed almost too astonishing to be real. For decades, the accepted narrative had placed the first humans in the Americas around 13,000 years ago, associated with the Clovis culture, stone tool makers whose distinctive spear points had been found across North America. The idea that people could have arrived 10,000 years earlier, during the height of the Ice Age, sounded almost heretical. After all, vast ice sheets still sealed the northern continents, and conventional wisdom said the migration routes were blocked. But the footprints didn't lie, nor did the layers they were found in. The team carefully extracted samples from above and below the prints, analysing seeds of the aquatic plant Rupia serosa, trapped in the same strata. Using radiocarbon dating, they determined the seeds were roughly 21 to 23,000 years old, right in the middle of the last glacial maximum. The conclusion was clear and startling. Humans were present in the Americas thousands of years before the ice-free corridors had even opened. Imagine the scene itself: a pale, wind-stilled morning, a shallow lake reflecting a grey sky, the air cool but not unbearable. This was the far southern fringe of the glacial world, a semi-arid grassland dotted with patches of water and reeds. Along the edge of the lake, a small group moves together. You can picture them barefoot, stepping carefully on the wet sand. Children run ahead, leaving erratic trails of small prints. Adults follow, carrying baskets or spears, maybe scanning the shore for eggs or plants. Nearby, massive shapes loom. A family of Columbian mammoths wading into the shallows, a giant ground sloth lumbering across the mud, leaving clawed impressions the size of plates. The fossil record confirms this scene. Intermingled with the human footprints are tracks of megafauna: mammoth, camel, dire wolf, and the enormous sloth. In some places, human prints overlap with animal ones, suggesting deliberate proximity. One sequence even shows a person walking straight through the fresh track of a sloth, as if following or investigating it. Whether they were hunting, scavenging, or simply sharing the same watering place, these footprints capture a real moment, a frozen intersection of species, a rare, still life of coexistence. Still, extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. Many archaeologists hesitated to accept such an ancient date. Radiocarbon dating of seeds, after all, can be complicated. Organic material can move between layers, and contamination might skew results. But science thrives on scrutiny, and in 2023 new studies revisited the site with different techniques. Using optically stimulated luminescence, a method that measures when mineral grains were last exposed to sunlight, researchers confirmed the same age range, around 23,000 years ago. Pollen analysis added another layer of support. Tiny grains of ancient flora preserved in the sediment matched the cold, arid vegetation expected during the last glacial maximum, not the warmer environment of later millennia. The convergence of evidence became difficult to ignore. It is, without exaggeration, one of the most remarkable discoveries in modern archaeology, not because it rewrites all of human prehistory, but because it forces us to widen the edges of what we thought was possible. If people were in New Mexico at that time, then they must have entered the Americas much earlier, perhaps thousands of years before, following coastlines or ice margins into a land still half frozen. It means that even at the coldest moment of the Ice Age, human beings were exploring, adapting, and thriving in new worlds. What's striking about the White Sands footprints is not just their age, but their intimacy. Unlike stone tools or charred bones, footprints carry personality. They are motion captured in mud, the pace, the rhythm, even the hesitation of a step. You can sense the weight of the walker, the speed of their stride, the softness of the ground. One set appears to belong to a young woman or adolescent, carrying something heavy, walking steadily across the wet flat before turning back along the same route hours later. Another cluster, smaller and scattered, likely belong to children, playing or following. Some prints are smeared, as if through mud, suggesting a hurry. Others are perfect, showing toes splayed as they lifted. To see them today is to feel an almost impossible closeness to lives long gone. What were these people doing there, in the middle of an Ice Age desert? The clues are scarce, but telling. Around the same layers, scientists have found seeds, pollen, and traces of wetland plants. Evidence that Lake Otero's basin was still intermittently full of fresh water. Megafauna gathered there to drink, and humans likely came to hunt or forage along its shores. Perhaps they harvested edible roots or seeds, or scavenged animal carcasses stranded in the mud. The climate would have been cool, dry, but survivable, a refuge in a world otherwise locked in frost. We don't know what these early Americans looked like, what languages they spoke, or where their ancestors had come from. But we do know they were skilled survivors. They lived during the same period when humans in Europe were carving ivory figurines and painting in caves, when Siberian hunters built bone houses against the cold. They shared that same capacity for imagination and endurance. The people of White Sands were part of the same global story. One species, dispersed across continents, learning to inhabit even the most improbable corners of the planet. And perhaps that's what makes the White Sands discovery so haunting. For years, archaeologists had debated when the first Americans arrived, as if there were a single moment, a single crossing. But these footprints suggest something more fluid, a slow wave of exploration, not an invasion. Groups testing boundaries, following coasts, rivers, and herds, expanding, retreating, trying again. The footprints are not a starting point. They are a mid-step, a trace of something already established. In the silence of that dry lake bed today, scientists have mapped hundreds of these impressions. The wind scours the surface, revealing and then recovering them. Each time one appears, it's like watching the past breathe. And as researchers study them grain by grain, they also confront a humbling thought. These tracks survived the melting of the ice, the drying of the lake, and the birth of deserts, only to meet us now, when we too are changing the planet's climate. Their endurance feels almost like a message about time itself. If we follow their trail in imagination, it leads outward, across the plains of Ice Age North America, where grass bent under frost and herds of extinct giants roamed. Somewhere beyond the horizon, these travellers made camp, kindled fires, told stories. The smoke rose into the same sky we see tonight. The soil of White Sands holds no words, only footprints. But sometimes that's enough. Because in those silent steps lies proof that even at the peak of the Ice Age, when cold and isolation ruled the continents, the human story was already global, and that no frontier, no glacier, no frozen sea could keep us from walking forward. What if I told you that between Asia and America once stretched a vanished world, a land so vast and alive that mammoths roamed where today only waves roll, and that for thousands of years an entire people may have called it home? Imagine a steppe of gold and frost beneath a sky of endless twilight. Herds of a bison moving like dark rivers, wolves howling across tundra valleys that no longer exist. And in the midst of this frozen expanse, small bands of humans building fires, raising shelters, and waiting. waiting for the world of ice to move aside. It is 22,000 years ago. The last glacial maximum grips the planet. But here, on the roof of the North Pacific, life holds its breath in a peculiar balance. Sea levels have dropped more than 100 meters, exposing a vast bridge of land that connects Siberia to Alaska, a region we now call Beringia. Far from being a sterile ice desert, Beringia was something extraordinary. A cold but rich grassland ecosystem where hardy plants thrived in the brief Arctic summers and herds of steppe bison, reindeer, and mammoths grazed on the low, dry tundra. This was not merely a crossing. It was a continent in its own right, stretching from the Lena River in Siberia to the Mackenzie River in Canada, nearly 2,000 kilometers wide. A world that would one day disappear beneath the Bering Sea. For a long time, scientists imagined this land bridge only as a corridor, a temporary path for migration. But genetic and archaeological evidence now suggests something far deeper and stranger. That Beringia was not just a passage, but a pause, a place where time itself seemed to slow. This idea is known as the Beringian standstill hypothesis. According to it, a group of modern humans left Asia perhaps 25,000 years ago, reaching the open tundras of eastern Beringia. Then, trapped between the glaciers of Siberia and the continental ice walls of North America, they stayed for thousands of years. The genetics tell the story more precisely than the stones. When researchers examined the DNA of indigenous American peoples, they found a pattern unlike any other. The genetic line that would become the first Americans diverged from its Asian relatives roughly 25,000 years ago, but did not spread south until about 15,000 years ago. Something had held them in place for nearly 10 millennia. That something was Beringia, a refuge suspended between worlds, where the ancestors of all later American peoples endured, adapted, and evolved in isolation. It is a haunting image. Generations born and buried in a landscape now lost beneath the sea. They lived through cold so severe that even their fires froze at the edges, through endless winters when the sun barely rose, through summers where the tundra erupted with flowers and insects and migratory birds. Yet in this isolation, they thrived. Archaeological hints from both sides of the vanished bridge support their presence. In the Yukon's permafrost, the bones of butchered horses and mammoths lie buried beside cut marks, unmistakably made by stone tools. At the Bluefish Caves in northwestern Canada, bone fragments bearing slicing scars date to around 24,000 years ago. Small but significant signs that humans were already here, working meat, shaping tools, surviving at the northern edge of the possible. To stand on Beringia then would have felt like being suspended between ages. To the west lay the frozen steppes of Siberia. To the east, the wall of the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets that sealed off the Americas. The ocean to the south was distant, glinting blue beneath sheets of sea ice. Yet the interior was alive, not green but vibrant in its own austere way. Grasses and sedges rippled in the constant wind. Stunted willows clung low to the ground. Musk oxen trudged through the snow, and foxes darted across their tracks. In spring, migratory birds arrived by the thousands, and rivers teemed with fish beneath thin films of ice. Here, humans built a life. They would have fashioned shelters from mammoth bones covered with hide stitched tight with sinew. Fire pits lined with stone would glow through the endless dark. In summer, they followed herds across the low plains. In winter, they huddled in semi-permanent camps, storing dried meat and fat in pits dug into the permafrost. The rhythm of their year was the rhythm of survival, predictable, yet always fragile. It's difficult to imagine the psychological world of those who lived here. Imagine a horizon where the land never ends but the world does. Ice to one side, impassable mountains to the other, sea frozen for half the year. The isolation must have been immense. For centuries, perhaps millennia, there was no way forward and no way back. And yet, within this stillness, a culture evolved. Languages changed. Myths were born. Children learned to walk on soil that no longer exists. These were not mere migrants. They were residents of a continent that time would erase. Modern climate reconstructions confirm that Beringia was indeed more habitable than many surrounding regions. The glaciers that choked the rest of the world actually diverted moisture away, leaving Beringia relatively dry and windswept but stable. Plants survived here that perished elsewhere. The result was what scientists call a refugium, a biological and human sanctuary in an otherwise frozen planet. Beringia, in essence, was a cradle. The genetic echoes of that cradle remain alive today. Every indigenous group in the Americas, from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, carries the legacy of those Beringian ancestors. Within their mitochondrial DNA, passed through mothers over countless generations, are traces of that long isolation. Population models show a severe bottleneck. A small number of families, perhaps only a few thousand individuals, sustaining their lineage for millennia before expanding southward when the ice finally began to melt. When they did, they carried with them the memories and adaptations of that northern exile. For now, though, in this story's frozen present, 22,000 years ago, they are still waiting. Fires flicker against the howling wind. The aurora dances overhead, green and silent. A hunter kneels beside a hole in the river ice, spear ready, watching the water's black reflection. Somewhere nearby, a woman tends to a child by the fire, humming softly under her breath. The smoke from their hearths rises into the endless Arctic sky, visible for miles in the still air. No one outside this place knows they exist. But one day, their descendants will walk every forest, every desert, every mountain of the New World. The traces of their presence linger not only in genes, but in the landscape itself. As the permafrost thaws, it reveals their neighbours, the bones of horses, bison and mammoths preserved with astonishing clarity. Some still bear the marks of human blades. At Bluefish Caves, the cut lines on the bones were first doubted, dismissed as natural scratches. Only decades later, microscopic analysis proved they were deliberate. Humans had indeed been there long before the Great Melt. What they thought, how they saw themselves, we may never know. But to imagine them is to imagine patience turned into identity. A people who lived in a place of waiting for the ice to retreat, for the seas to rise, for the world to reopen. When the glaciers finally began to crumble thousands of years later, their descendants would follow the valleys southward, stepping into lands no human had ever seen. The White Sands footprints, far to the south and thousands of years in the future, may be the faint echoes of that long pause ending, a journey resumed after 10,000 years of stillness. Today, the world that held them lies drowned beneath the grey waters between Siberia and Alaska. The Bering Sea rolls over it, cold and deep. But beneath its floor, sediments still preserve traces of ancient soil, pollen from tundra plants, and the footprints of caribou and mammoth that once shared this vanished plain. Somewhere down there, in the mud and silt, lie the unmarked graves of the people who waited, the ones who bridged two continents not by movement, but by endurance. It's strange to think that the first Americans might have been born not in Asia or the Americas, but in between them, in a place that no longer exists, a place both real and mythical. A world erased, but remembered in every genome and every map of deep time. In the story of humanity, Bringia was the breath we took before we spoke a new world into being. What if I told you that 21,000 years ago the world map looked entirely wrong? Seas vanished, continents fused, and where waves now crash, people and mammoths once walked. Imagine looking at the earth and finding twice as much land. No Mediterranean sparkle, no English Channel, no scattered islands of Indonesia, only one continuous mass of rock, sand and tundra. The coastlines we know today did not exist. They were hundreds of feet below you, buried beneath cold air and mammoth grass. For a brief geological heartbeat, the oceans retreated, and the planet's bones were exposed. At the height of the Last Glacial Maximum, so much of Earth's water was locked inside the great northern ice sheets that the global sea level fell by roughly 120 metres, about 400 feet lower than today. That's not a poetic exaggeration. That's the entire vertical span of a modern skyscraper, removed from the ocean and poured into glaciers. The result was a planet almost unrecognisable to our modern eyes. Vast new continents emerged. Rivers extended for hundreds of kilometres farther than they do now, and once separate lands became linked by broad, dry plains. In a very real sense, it was the age of land. Let's take a slow walk around that forgotten world map. Begin in what is now Southeast Asia, where the islands of Sumatra, Java and Borneo were not islands at all. The shallow seas that divide them today had drained away, revealing a continuous stretch of land called Sundaland, a warm tropical expanse that connected mainland Asia all the way to the modern coasts of Indonesia. It was a world of monsoon grasslands, dry forests and wide river valleys. Tigers, elephants and early humans all roamed across what is now ocean floor. If you stood on a ridge near today's Hanoi, you could have looked south and seen a horizon of endless plains where the South China Sea now lies. And if you walked far enough, you could have reached Jakarta without ever touching a boat. Farther south, another landmass waited, Sahul. Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania were not separate islands then, but part of one enormous supercontinent. The shallow seas that now divide them were dry basins and savannas, sometimes crossed by braided rivers. Megafauna like the giant kangaroo Procoptodon and the marsupial lion Thylacoleo still stalked its plains, though they were in their final centuries. Human communities had already adapted to the continent's harsh rhythms, moving between coasts and inland lakes that are now lost beneath the Timor and Arafura seas. When the water later returned, the people remained, but their worlds split into islands. Move westward, and the pattern repeats. The Persian Gulf, now a deep basin of salt water, was once a vast green plain fed by rivers flowing from the Tigris, Euphrates, and Karun. Archaeologists call this the Persian Gulf Oasis hypothesis, the idea that the Gulf's dry floor may have supported freshwater lakes and fertile floodplains that hosted some of the earliest human groups long before the rise of known civilizations. It may even have served as a refuge during the coldest centuries of the Ice Age, a place where herders and hunters gathered before the climate warmed. Today, every trace of that plain lies drowned beneath 50 metres of seawater, sealed in darkness and silt. To the north, what we now call the North Sea was then an open meadow. Doggerland, a name given centuries later by archaeologists, connected Britain directly to mainland Europe. It stretched from modern Denmark to the white cliffs of Dover, a land of rivers, forests, and reindeer herds. Though this story takes place before its Mesolithic flourishing, even at the Ice Age peak, that plain was there, cold, wind-swept, but habitable. Woolly rhinoceroses and red deer wandered its valleys, and when the ice eventually retreated, humans would return to settle its shores until the sea rose again and erased it from memory. Across the globe, the pattern of exposure repeated like a pulse of breath. On the continental shelves of China, the Philippines, and northern Australia, shallow seas gave way to rolling plains. In the Caribbean, islands fused together into larger land masses. Even the mighty Mediterranean was smaller, its basins partially desiccated. And in the far north, the Bering Land Bridge, that great frozen corridor between Asia and the Americas, reached its widest point. You could have walked from Siberia to Alaska over a plain hundreds of kilometers across, under a sky streaked with migrating birds and auroral light. It's difficult to overstate how profoundly this reshaped life. These new coastal plains were ecological highways, rich with rivers, lakes, and vegetation. Herds of mammoths, bison, and caribou followed these corridors across continents, and humans followed the herds. What we call migration was, to them, simply movement. To cross from one continent to another required no sail, only time and endurance. For tens of thousands of years, this expanded world allowed our species to spread further than ever before. And yet it also means something quietly tragic. Most of that record is gone. The very landscapes that sustained human life are now hidden beneath the ocean. The coastal camps where families gathered, the middens of shell and bone, the first harbours of humanity, all were built along shorelines that have long since drowned. The geological archives that survive are on land, far from the coasts where life actually thrived. This is one reason prehistory feels incomplete. Much of it lies under 400 feet of water. Imagine standing at the edge of one of those coasts 21 millennia ago. The air is cool and dry. The sea lies far below, a faint silver line on the horizon. You walk down a slope that today would be a continental shelf covered then in shrubs and grass. Perhaps mammoths graze nearby. Perhaps the distant sound of a river reaches you. The world feels enormous and strangely empty, yet it is full of life, full of possibility. It is a planet rebalanced, its waters drawn up into towers of ice. Scientists have tried to reconstruct this drowned geography using bathymetric data, essentially seafloor topography mapped by sonar and satellites. The contours reveal old valleys, river mouths, and floodplains that match what would have been dry land 20 millennia ago. Some areas, like the Sunda Shelf in Southeast Asia, still show the traces of ancient drainage networks, ghost rivers that once carried fresh water across lands now buried by tropical seas. Archaeologists are beginning to explore these underwater worlds, though the work is slow and challenging. In recent decades, divers off the coast of India have found what appear to be submerged human structures. In the Gulf of Mexico, ancient stone tools have been recovered from drowned riverbeds, and in the North Sea, trawl nets occasionally bring up mammoth bones or flint tools from the lost floor of Doggerland. Each fragment is a reminder that our map of human history is incomplete, that for every cave we excavate on land, another site sleeps beneath the waves. There is a quiet humour in this perspective. If an Ice Age traveller could return today, they might look at our modern coastlines and think the planet had somehow shrunk. The journey from Hanoi to Jakarta, once a walk through endless plains and valleys, now requires a flight over ocean. The path from Britain to France, once a few days' trek across tundra, now demands a boat or a tunnel. Our continents have retreated, and the sea has reclaimed its kingdom. The emotional weight of this realization is subtle but profound. Every shoreline hides a memory. Beneath the calm surface of the Arafura Sea, the Yellow Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the North Sea lie the homes, camps, and paths of our ancestors. Their fire-stoned and bones may still be there, waiting under silt, an entire Ice Age world entombed, not in ice, but in saltwater silence. The Ice Age lowered the oceans, and humanity walked farther than ever before. When the ice melted, the seas rose and the map we know today was born. But for a brief span, around 21,000 years ago, the Earth itself seemed to open, offering land where there had been none. It was both an opportunity and a promise, a glimpse of the planet's hidden potential. What we now call lost continents were once simply home. Perhaps one day, through ocean archaeology and remote mapping, we'll rediscover pieces of those vanished coasts. Until then, we know enough to say this much. The Ice Age did not just shape climate or species, it sculpted the very stage on which the human story unfolded. And even now, the echoes of that map still define who we are. An island species, always longing for the shorelines we once walked. What if I told you that the first humans to make pottery didn't live in warm river valleys with crops or temples, but in a freezing Ice Age cave surrounded by mammoths and snow? Imagine a small group of hunter-gatherers in southern China 20,000 years ago, sheltering beneath limestone cliffs. The wind outside cuts like glass. Inside, near the hearth's orange glow, someone is doing something no one on Earth has done before. They're shaping clay, wet, sticky, stubborn, into a small vessel with their bare hands. It's crude, uneven, probably full of cracks. But as they place it near the fire, slowly hardening it into something solid, they're inventing a future. At a time when most humans lived entirely on what nature provided, hunting, gathering, following the seasons, someone in a cave called Shanrendong, in modern-day Jiangxi province, decided to transform Earth itself. Archaeologists excavating this site found fragments of fired clay, small curved pieces that once formed bowls and pots. Radiocarbon dating places them at around 20,000 to 19,000 years before the present, deep in the heart of the Last Glacial Maximum. These fragments, now housed carefully in museum drawers, are the world's earliest known pottery. To put that in perspective, this pottery predates agriculture by more than 10,000 years. The first farmers wouldn't till the soil until the Holocene warmed the world. Yet here, Ice Age foragers had already discovered the alchemy of clay and fire. The pottery of Shanrendong wasn't decorative, it wasn't ceremonial, it was practical, blackened with soot, rough to the touch, the product of necessity and ingenuity. Picture the process. The clay would have been collected from riverbanks nearby, mixed with grass or crushed shell to prevent cracking. The vessel would have been hand-moulded, probably without a potter's wheel, and left to dry near the hearth before being baked by open flame or buried in coals. The marks of fingers remain in some fragments. On others, researchers found traces of soot, suggesting they had been used for cooking, likely boiling bones or fish to extract fats and nutrients, or perhaps rendering plants that needed heat to become edible. In a world where every calorie meant survival, being able to boil food was revolutionary. The timing makes the discovery even more remarkable. 20,000 years ago, global temperatures were at their lowest. The last glacial maximum forced human populations into refuges, small habitable pockets scattered across Eurasia. Resources were scarce, the environment unforgiving. Yet under such pressure, innovation didn't vanish. It accelerated. In East Asia, and especially southern China and Japan, where the climate was harsh but not entirely glaciated, human groups experimented with materials in ways unseen elsewhere. A few hundred kilometers from Jianrendong, another cave, Ukrainian, also in southern China, yielded pottery fragments almost as ancient. And across the sea, on the Japanese island of Honshu, the ancestors of what would later be called the Jomon people were making their own rudimentary pots by around 16,000 years ago. Even in the frozen north, in Siberia, ceramic shards appear by 17,000 years ago. These weren't isolated miracles. They were part of a regional pattern, a quiet technological awakening. Why here? Why then? One theory suggests the cold itself drove invention. In glacial Asia, food options were limited, and cooking became essential to extract nutrition from bones, roots, and fish. Pottery allowed boiling, a method impossible with simple fires and hides. It also helped store liquids, a precious resource in the cold, dry season. In essence, pottery extended survival. It let humans get more from less. When you think about it, that's how most great innovations begin. Not from comfort, but from pressure, from scarcity, from the stubbornness to endure. These Ice Age potters were not artisans in any modern sense. They were pragmatic visionaries. Their hands, rough from scraping hides and cutting meat, found a way to make clay into a tool. It's strange to imagine that while much of Europe was still locked under ice, somewhere in Asia, people were boiling soup. Archaeologists analysing the Xianrendong fragments under microscopes found microscopic traces of fat and bone collagen embedded in the clay, residue from cooking animal materials. The inner surfaces were uneven and blackened, showing repeated use. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a culinary revolution. The pottery itself was surprisingly sophisticated for its age. Some fragments show deliberate shaping into rounded forms, with rim curvature suggesting bowls large enough to hold several litres. The surfaces were sometimes smoothed or wiped with grass, leaving characteristic impressions. They were low-fired, perhaps reaching temperatures of 500 to 600 degrees Celsius, just enough to harden the clay without vitrifying it. In archaeological terms, this represents a technological threshold, the first time humans manipulated fire not just for warmth or tool-making, but for transforming raw matter into a durable vessel. We tend to link pottery with farming, villages, and storage, with the Neolithic world of granaries and settled life. But discoveries like Xianrendong have forced scientists to rethink that narrative. Pottery came first, agriculture came later. Our ancestors didn't wait for domesticated plants to start reshaping the world around them. They were already experimenting, already transforming landscapes, materials, and possibilities. If we could stand beside them, in the half-dark of that limestone shelter, the smell of smoke thick in the air, we'd see people who look and think like us. Clever, tired, curious. A young woman kneels beside the fire, checking the clay's surface for cracks. An older man tends the coals, shifting them carefully to even the heat. A child pokes a stick into the ashes, impatient. Outside, snow falls quietly. They don't know they're inventing something that will last for tens of millennia. To them, it's just another small experiment in survival. But this one will change everything. When the pot hardens and cools, it's light enough to carry, sturdy enough to use again. Over time, the idea spreads. Not instantly, not globally, but in slow ripples. Across the region, small communities begin to adopt clay for cooking, storage, and even symbolic use. In time, the knowledge will cross rivers and mountains, eventually reaching other continents. But for now, in this cave, the future is being shaped by hands caked in mud. What's most humbling about this discovery is what it says about human nature. Innovation is not a straight line. It doesn't belong to any one culture or era. It sparks wherever the conditions demand it, wherever curiosity meets need. The people of Xianrendong didn't invent pottery because they were advanced. They invented it because they were alive, and living in a cold world required creativity. We can only speculate what that first meal cooked in clay tasted like. Perhaps boiled reindeer bones or fish soup thickened with roots. Whatever it was the first meal ever prepared in pottery. the earliest evidence of humanity's long relationship with cooking vessels that would one day fill every kitchen on Earth. Today, when archaeologists hold those blackened shards in their hands, they hold the echoes of a moment that bridged survival and civilization. Not because it was grand, but because it was ordinary. The quiet hum of necessity that drives all human progress. Even in the Ice Age, beneath the layers of cold and hardship, invention simmered. And from those fires of survival came the first glimmers of culture, fragile, earthen, and timeless. What if I told you that the ice didn't just sculpt mountains and valleys, it sculpted us? That as the glaciers began to retreat around 19,000 years ago, the human map of the world was rewritten not with stone or fire, but in DNA. Imagine a frozen planet slowly exhaling for the first time in millennia. Ice sheets begin to melt at their edges. Rivers swell. Grass returns to valleys that have been tundra for generations. And across these thawing lands, families who have been isolated for thousands of years begin to move again, to meet, to mix, to disappear, and to give rise to the people who would inherit the next world. For most of human history, this story was invisible. Archaeologists could see the tools, the bones, the camps, but not the bloodlines. Now with ancient DNA, we can. Each genome extracted from an Ice Age skeleton is a time capsule, a record of migrations and meetings written in the smallest alphabet nature ever made. 19,000 years ago marks a turning point. The planet is still cold, but the great ice sheets that had smothered the north for 10,000 years are beginning to loosen. In Europe, in Asia, in the Americas, human populations start to shift. Some return to old homelands long abandoned under snow. Others move into new ones left empty by extinction. The Ice Age is not over, but its grip is weakening, and life, human life, begins to flow again. Let's begin in Western Europe, where one of the great Ice Age refuges endured. In a cave in northern Spain, archaeologists found the remains of a young man who lived roughly 23,000 years ago, at the height of the Glacial Maximum. His DNA, studied decades later, would reveal something astonishing. It carried genetic links both to people who lived in Europe before the ice reached its peak, and to those who reappeared thousands of years later, after the glaciers retreated. In other words, his lineage, the Western refuge, survived the deep freeze intact. When the world thawed, his descendants spread out again across the continent. Geneticists now call this the Iberian refuge lineage. It's the root of what later became the Magdalenian peoples. Hunters and artists who filled caves from France to Germany with vivid paintings of bison and horses. Their DNA is the bridge that connects the pre-Ice Age Gravettians to the post-Ice Age Europeans. In the face of catastrophic cold, this Western group didn't vanish. They waited. They endured in valleys shielded from the wind, along coasts where game still wandered. And when the ice finally released its hold, they expanded northward and eastward again, repeopling half a continent. But the story wasn't the same everywhere. In Eastern Europe, the genetic record tells of silence and replacement. Before the last glacial maximum, there had been thriving groups of hunters, what archaeologists call the Eastern Gravettian cultures, ranging across the plains of Ukraine, Russia, and the Balkans. Their toolkits were sophisticated, their camps numerous. But after the height of the ice, their genetic fingerprints vanish. When people returned to those regions thousands of years later, the DNA was different. A 2023 study published in Nature compared fossils from Italy before and after 17,000 years ago. The result was clear. The earlier cave dwellers, who had lived there during the height of the Ice Age, were not the ancestors of those who came later. Instead, the later Italians carried genes linked to populations from the east, perhaps from the Black Sea or Anatolia, suggesting that as the glaciers withdrew, New peoples moved in from southeastern Europe and replaced or absorbed the old. So, while the Iberian refuge in the west persisted, the east saw renewal, or loss, depending on how you read it. Two human lineages, two fates. For 10,000 years, Europe was divided between them. The Westerners, isolated but surviving, and the Easterners, vanishing and being replaced. When the world warmed, these two currents met again, merging, mingling, and shaping the genetic landscape of Europe as we know it. The power of ancient DNA is that it makes these invisible encounters visible. The data show that when Ice Age Europe warmed, the descendants of the Iberian refuge spread northeast, meeting newcomers from the Balkans and Black Sea basin. Their interactions left genetic mosaics, individuals whose DNA carries pieces of both histories. Archaeologically, this matches what we see. Magdalenian tools spreading west to east, epigravettian tools spreading east to west. The boundaries weren't neat, they were porous, they were human. Meanwhile, far away in the north, other migrations were beginning. In the vast corridor of Beringia, that now drowned world connecting Asia and America, the population that had waited in isolation for thousands of years began to move. As ice barriers melted, they fanned out across the Americas, carrying with them the genetic signature that every indigenous group in the New World still bears today. From Alaska to Patagonia, that expansion would become one of humanity's greatest journeys, a continental wave that began right here, around 19,000 years ago, when the ice first cracked open a path. In Asia, too, the thaw reshaped the map of people. During the coldest centuries, northern Siberia had been nearly empty, a frozen steppe where only mammoths and reindeer endured. But as the temperatures rose, human groups began to return. Ancient DNA from sites like Malta and Afontova Gora, near Lake Baikal, show that people with mixed ancestry, part East Asian, part ancient northern Eurasian, began to reappear, pushing north along rivers and reoccupying lands once too harsh for habitation. These were not the same individuals who had lived there before the freeze. Their genomes show admixture, the genetic term for mixing. As the cold loosened, the boundaries of isolation dissolved, and genes began to flow again. It's tempting to think of this as a scientific puzzle, populations, lineages, migrations, but behind those genetic codes were real lives. Imagine two groups meeting after millennia apart. They might not have understood each other's words, but their children would have bridged the difference. In every contact zone, DNA records the same story, diversity returning. For thousands of years, the Ice Age had compressed humanity into a handful of refuges. Around 19,000 years ago, those refugees opened, and the branches of our family tree began to intertwine again. The changes left traces even in our biology. Genetic variation, which had narrowed during the harshest millennia, began to widen once more. New alleles, mutations, adaptations, spread as populations met and mixed. Some of these differences still shape us today. The pale skin tones that evolved in Europe's dim light, the endurance traits adapted to cold climates, the subtle shifts in metabolism that trace back to ancient winters. Each was carried forward, refined by contact and survival. In a sense, this was humanity's second wind. The glaciers receded, rivers roared again, and people followed them. They met cousins they had never known they had. Some encounters were peaceful, others likely not. But the result was renewal, the reweaving of a species that had been scattered and starved of connection. If you were to map the world then, not by geography but by genetics, it would look like veins of colour reconnecting after long dormancy. In Western Europe, the Magdalenian lineage spreading northward from Iberia. In Eastern Europe, new arrivals from the Balkans filling empty plains. In Asia, populations expanding north and east from China and Central Asia. Across the Pacific corridor, the descendants of Beringia moving south through corridors of melting ice. Each of these threads converges on a single moment, 19,000 years ago, when the world began to move again. The remarkable thing is how much of that story was invisible until recently. Ancient DNA technology has transformed prehistory. Just a decade ago, scientists could only guess at these migrations. Now, with genomes extracted from tiny fragments of bone, a tooth here, a finger bone there, we can watch the slow dance of human ancestry unfold. We can see when populations split, when they met again, when they vanished. It's a form of time travel, but through molecules instead of machines. And yet, even as we peer deeper into that record, humility remains essential. Each discovery raises new questions. The DNA tells us where genes flowed, but not what those people felt. Their fears, alliances, or songs. It tells us when they met, but not what they said. The story we can read is one of connection, survival, and change, but not of meaning. That part perhaps is left to imagination, to empathy. By the end of the Ice Age, the genetic foundations of the modern world had been laid. Every continent except Antarctica now held human life, shaped by its own blend of ancient lineages. The last great isolation was over. The world was still cold, but the future, our future, had already begun to thaw. Imagine kneeling in the half-light of a cave 18,000 years ago. Your breath clouds in the cold air. The fire behind you flickers against limestone walls patterned with soot and ochre handprints. In front of you lies someone you knew, her face calm now, her skin pale against the red earth. You reach into a leather pouch and scatter crimson dust over her. Powdered ochre, gathered days ago from a cliff far down the valley. The red settles on her cheeks, her arms, her hair. Beside her, someone else lays small green sprigs, the last of the season's flowers, delicate even in death. The air smells of smoke, clay and sorrow. You stay a moment longer, not speaking. Then you place a flat stone over her and leave, knowing that this cave, this quiet hollow in the mountains of Spain, will keep her forever. That woman, buried almost 19 millennia ago in El Mirón cave in northern Spain, would one day be called the Red Lady. She was around 35 to 40 years old when she died, middle age for her time, perhaps a grandmother, perhaps a matriarch. Her people belonged to the Magdalenian culture, the late heirs of Europe's Ice Age hunters and artists, those who painted the bison of Altamira and the horses of Lascaux. The world around them was still cold, but softening, the glaciers in retreat, grasslands returning, rivers thawing. Yet even amid that fragile renewal, they stopped to mourn one of their own. The burial itself was discovered in 2011 by archaeologists working deep inside the cave. Her bones were fragile, coloured with red ochre that had soaked into the surrounding sediment. The ochre wasn't random. It had been applied deliberately, probably as part of the funeral rite. This alone was remarkable, but what truly startled scientists came later, when microscopic analysis revealed something unexpected. Pollen. Not random grains blown in by wind, but concentrated clusters of pollen from flowering plants in the Chenopodiaceae family. Plants that bloom briefly, with small delicate blossoms. The placement and density of this pollen suggested that the flowers themselves had been laid in the grave. In other words, someone had given the Red Lady of El Mirón a bouquet. This moment, frozen in soil for nearly 19,000 years, is one of the oldest known acts of floral offering in human history. Before this discovery, archaeologists had already known that Ice Age burials could be complex. Graves at Sungir in Russia or Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic showed beads, ochre, and careful positioning. But flowers, ephemeral, beautiful, unnecessary, tell a different kind of story. They speak not just of ritual, but of affection. The scientists, cautious as always, first ruled out practical explanations. Could the pollen have drifted in naturally? Could it have come from plants used as bedding or food? The answer, after months of testing, was no. The pollen concentration matched what would be expected from whole flowers placed at the time of burial. It was as if even the soil remembered a gesture of kindness. Imagine the scene again, now through their eyes. The woman's body rests in a niche within the cave, sheltered from wind and snow. Around her are stone slabs, intentionally arranged to cover and protect. The red ochre gives her body a luminous quality, as though still warm. The flowers, likely soft green stems with tiny clustered blossoms, are laid beside her hands and near her head. The mourners move slowly, performing a sequence that must have held meaning. The dusting of pigment, the laying of blooms, the final closing of the grave. Somewhere on the cave wall nearby, someone carves or engraves a faint image, perhaps as a mark of remembrance. Indeed, archaeologists found a block near the burial with engravings from the same period, linking this corner of the cave to both art and death. What makes this burial extraordinary is not its complexity, but its humanity. There's nothing utilitarian about flowers. They are not tools, weapons, or food. They wilt and vanish. To bring them into a cave, to lay them by a body, is an act of love, a small defiance against mortality. It suggests that these Ice Age people didn't just mourn, they commemorated. They saw death not merely as absence, but as passage. Anthropologists often remind us to be careful with emotion when reading the past. But the evidence from El Mirón makes restraint difficult. The care with which the Red Lady was treated suggests that her community saw her as more than flesh. They honoured her with colour and scent. They marked her presence. The ochre itself may have symbolised life, blood, or rebirth, ideas echoed in prehistoric graves across continents. Even the choice of flowers could carry meaning. Some species in that family have medicinal or cleansing properties. Whether symbolic or spontaneous, the act is intimate, human, and deeply recognisable. And yet this burial also reminds us how rare such preservation is. Most Ice Age deaths left no trace beyond scattered bones. Ritualised burials like this one, intentional, adorned and sealed, are uncommon. But when they occur, they tell us that by the late Pleistocene, humanity had already developed emotional and symbolic depth equal to our own. These people were not primitive brutes eking out existence. They were thinkers, feelers, mourners. The Red Lady's contemporaries were among the last of Europe's great hunter-gatherer cultures. They lived through climatic upheaval, watched glaciers retreat and ecosystems transform. They hunted reindeer, ibex and wild horses, crafted bone needles and engraved antler tools. They painted caves with precision and imagination. To them, perhaps, life itself was fragile enough to make its loss sacred. When her grave was reopened by archaeologists nearly 90 millennia later, the red of the ochre was still vivid, as though time had not dared to touch it. One of the researchers wrote that seeing it for the first time felt like meeting her halfway through history. And indeed, in that moment, science and empathy intersect. The data, radiocarbon dates, pollen charts, stratigraphy, all confirm what the heart already knows, that she was loved. What remains of her body is modest, fragments of skull, jaw and limb bones, fragile and faintly coloured. But around them, the sediments still whisper details. The ochre was likely brought from a different valley, meaning her mourners travelled to retrieve it. The flowers were fresh, meaning they buried her quickly. The positioning suggests she was laid on her side, perhaps in the same posture of sleep. Each of these choices adds weight to the idea that her death was marked, her memory tended. There's an almost humorous humility in how scientists handled this. One pollen expert, when first seeing the data, reportedly asked, could they really have brought her flowers? It seemed too poetic, too sentimental, until every control test confirmed it. The soil told the truth. Someone, long ago, really did carry a handful of blossoms into that dark cave. This is the kind of discovery that bridges time. We cannot speak her language, but we understand her funeral. Across tens of millennia, the impulse to honour the dead remains one of the most consistent features of our species. From Ice Age caves to modern cemeteries, the gesture repeats. We colour, we decorate, we return to the earth what we love. In that sense, the Red Lady of Elmiron is not an isolated figure, but part of a much older continuum. Earlier burials, like the double children's grave at Sungir in Russia, adorned with beads and mammoth ivory, show that symbolic death rites stretch back over 30,000 years. But Elmiron adds a sensory dimension, colour and scent, ephemeral beauty preserved by accident. The pollen, invisible at the time, became her testimony. 18,000 years ago, deep in a cave lit by animal fat lamps, humans created not only art and tools, but memory. They took the time to honour the ephemeral, to bring light and fragrance into darkness. It's a reminder that compassion is as ancient as survival, that even when the world was ice and stone, someone still thought to bring flowers. And as the pollen clings to her grave even now, we can almost see that final moment, the touch of a hand, the scatter of red dust, the brief colour of life before the cold closed in. The Ice Age may have shaped our bodies, but gestures like this shaped our souls. Imagine this. After tens of millennia of cold and silence, the world begins to breathe again. The glaciers that once crushed valleys under walls of ice start to shudder and retreat. Meltwater trickles through the stone, then rushes into torrents. The frozen winds calm. For the first time in living memory, green begins to return. Thin grasses pushing through grey earth, followed by tiny flowers trembling in the thaw. Herds of reindeer lift their heads to sniff air that smells faintly of life again. Across the plains of what is now France and Central Europe, the humans who had survived in southern refuges look north and see opportunity. The Ice Age isn't over yet, but for the first time, it feels like it might be. 17,000 years ago marks the beginning of what scientists call the Late Glacial period, a slow, uneven warming that would eventually end the Pleistocene. The Last Glacial Maximum, that long, merciless freeze between roughly 26 and 19 millennia ago, had finally loosened its grip. Average global temperatures rose just a few degrees, but it was enough to transform entire continents. Ice sheets over northern Europe began to withdraw. Tundra and open grassland reclaimed their edges. Rivers once sealed under frost surged with meltwater, carving new paths through the land. Dust storms lessened, rainfall returned, and ecosystems stirred from their long hibernation. To those who lived through it, small bands of hunter-gatherers in Spain, France, or the Balkans, this must have felt like the world waking from a coma. For generations, humans had been confined to refuges along Europe's southern fringes, surviving on migratory herds and stored fat, rarely daring to venture north. Now, as the ice withdrew, they followed the same paths as the animals, tracing rivers and valleys into freshly opened territories. Each spring brought new pastures, and behind the herds came people. Archaeologists see this renewal in the material record, a sudden flourishing of culture and activity that defines the Magdalenian period in Europe. Beginning around 17,000 years ago, this was a time of expansion and creativity, a late Ice Age renaissance. Magdalenian groups crafted tools of stunning precision, barbed harpoons made of antler, spear throwers, lattles, carved with animal forms, and finely flaked stone blades designed for speed and efficiency. They built upon traditions inherited from their ancestors, but adapted them to the changing environment. More game meant new hunting strategies. More rivers meant new routes and opportunities. One of the Magdalenians' hallmarks is its art. Not only portable carvings and engravings, but the breathtaking paintings that still line the walls of caves across southwestern Europe. The most famous of these, at Lascaux in France, dates to roughly this very moment, around 17,000 years ago. Discovered by chance in 1940 by 4 teenagers and their dog, Lascaux's chambers contain over 600 painted figures. Bulls, horses, stags, and strange abstract signs, all brought to life by flickering lamplight. When you look at them, even today, it's impossible not to feel that same astonishment. The realization that these Ice Age artists saw beauty and abundance returning and wanted to honor it. Picture the world outside that cave. Spring grasses waving across what had been barren tundra only a few generations before. Herds of aurochs, massive wild cattle, moving across the valleys. Reindeer crowding near thawed rivers. Groups of people emerging from the Pyrenees or the Dordogne, setting up seasonal camps where they could hunt, carve, and paint. Perhaps those who painted the bulls of Lascaux were celebrating the return of life, or simply expressing awe at the herds they depended on. Either way, those walls became a monument to renewal. The archaeological record supports this sense of abundance. At sites across France, dating between 16 and 17,000 years ago, vast deposits of animal bone suggest large-scale communal hunts. Reindeer and wild horse remains are found in heaps, sometimes hundreds of individuals at a single site, indicating group drives or coordinated hunting efforts. The people who had survived scarcity now found themselves surrounded by plenty, and they adapted accordingly. Climate data from ice cores in Greenland shows that around this time, average temperatures began a steady climb. The glaciers over northern Europe and North America started to melt more rapidly, their runoff feeding swollen rivers and vast glacial lakes. The change wasn't uniform. Sudden cold reversals would still come, but overall the Earth was shifting toward warmth. Sea levels, which had been more than 100 meters lower than today, began creeping upward as ice melted into the oceans. For the humans of 17,000 years ago, the seas still lay far from their modern shores, but the world around them was visibly in flux. In this rebirth, the Magdalenian people's creativity extended beyond art and hunting. They engineered shelters of remarkable ingenuity, frameworks of bone or wood covered with hides, often circular, sometimes semi-subterranean for insulation. They sewed fitted clothing using bone needles and adorned themselves with beads carved from shells and animal teeth. Even in the harshest conditions, they had always valued adornment, but now, as life stabilized, that instinct for expression grew bolder. The same warmth that greened Europe also reshaped Africa and Asia. In North Africa, monsoon patterns strengthened slightly, turning some desert margins into savanna once more. In Central Asia, cold steppes softened into grasslands suitable for large herds of antelope and horses. These global shifts set the stage for humanity's next great dispersals, though most of those lay in the millennia ahead. For now, the focus was on adaptation and return, reclaiming territories that had been unreachable for 1,000 generations. A quiet humour lingers in imagining the relief these people must have felt. For tens of thousands of years, their ancestors had known only ice and scarcity. Now the climate itself seemed to sigh with them. You can almost picture a Magdalenian campfire conversation. The snow is later this year, one might say. Maybe we'll need fewer furs. A pause. Maybe next year we'll go north. Archaeologists often refer to this period as the rewilding of Europe, a vast ecological rebalancing. Where glaciers had stood, plants took root. Where tundra had stretched to the horizon, birch forests began to sprout. Steppe bison, horses, ibex, and mammoths roamed in dense herds. Wolves and cave lions shadowed them. The air was still cold, but the rhythm of life quickened. Humanity was no longer clinging to survival. It was thriving again. It's tempting to think of this warming as an uncomplicated blessing, but for those who lived it, change was still risky. Melting glaciers created new rivers and lakes, but also floods. Ice dams broke, releasing torrents across the plains. Seasonal cycles became unpredictable. The hunter's calendar had to be rewritten. Yet even in this uncertainty, humans adapted with astonishing resilience. Their migration routes lengthened, their tools diversified, and their art deepened. In every sense, biological, cultural, spiritual, this was a turning point. From the sombre cave of the Red Lady of El Miron, we travel just a millennium forward and find a very different scene. The grief of that ochre burial gives way to celebration, a world no longer defined by loss, but by renewal. The people who painted Lascaux may have descended from those mourners. If so, their art was an answer to sorrow, a declaration that life, despite everything, continues to bloom. By 17,000 years ago, the Ice Age still lingered. The great ice sheets of Scandinavia and Canada remained massive, but their boundaries were shrinking each year. Glacial winds softened, dust fell less often, and rainfall increased. Rivers swelled, carving valleys that humans followed deeper into the continent. The seas were still low, exposing vast coastal plains, but their edges trembled, foreshadowing the floods to come. Within a few thousand years, those rising waters would drown entire Ice Age landscapes like Doggerland and Sundaland, reshaping the map of human history. But in this moment, at 17,000, the world was wide open. We often measure prehistory in tens of millennia, but here, change unfolded within lifetimes. A child born when the first grasses appeared on the tundra could grow old under skies warmer and clearer than their parents had ever seen. They could watch forests take root where there had been ice and see herds move along new trails. These were the first humans to witness the Earth's rebirth, and to leave us evidence of their joy carved in bone and painted on rock. What makes this era so compelling is its sense of motion. Everything, air, water, animals, people, was shifting northward. The cold that had locked the planet for ages began to retreat, inch by inch, and humanity followed. The Magdalenian artists of Europe, the hunters of North Africa, the foragers of Siberia, all were participants in the same quiet revolution. They didn't know it, but their world was already on its way to becoming ours. And so, 17,000 years ago, the Ice Age began to thaw, not with a crash, but with a sigh. The winds softened, the rivers filled, the herds moved, and humans walked again through lands they had forgotten. They painted animals not as spirits of loss, but as companions in life's return. In the glow of torchlight, they traced those forms in ochre and black, their hands steady, their hearts full. The Ice Age was not yet over, but its grip was loosening. And somewhere, in the echoing halls of a cave called Lascaux, a small voice of colour declared, "The world is alive again." And as the warmth spread across continents, something subtler began to change, not just in the climate, but in the rhythm of human life itself. The people of 17,000 years ago were still nomadic, still bound to the pulse of migration and the chase of herds, but their seasonal cycles started to stretch and settle. Camps that once stood for mere weeks began to last entire seasons. Archaeologists find this shift in the layers of ancient hearths. Multiple fire circles built one above the other, generations of smoke imprinted into the same soil. Some sites in France and Spain show dozens of repeated occupations, as if the same families returned year after year to the same bend in a river or the same sheltering cliff. Permanence, in its earliest form, was being born in the age of Thor. These were not yet villages, but the seeds of belonging were taking root. The abundance of reindeer, salmon, and wild horses allowed people to stay longer, to build sturdier shelters, and to develop more complex social structures. In the Magdalenian layers of places like Pansevant and Etiole in France, archaeologists have mapped hearth clusters and activity zones, areas for tool-making, cooking and resting, like snapshots of ancient neighbourhoods. You can almost trace where one person sat chipping flint, while another scraped hides or roasted meat. These living floors capture the texture of community, not just survival, but cooperation, habit, and memory. The artefacts themselves speak of leisure as much as labour. Bone flutes reappear in the archaeological record during this time, echoing a tradition that had fallen silent during the depths of the Last Glacial Maximum. Carved pendants shaped like horses, birds, and human figures suggest both artistry and storytelling. Some archaeologists propose that these carvings, carried from camp to camp, may have served as tokens of identity or shared myths, reminders of who belonged to whom in an expanding world. When food is no longer scarce every day, people start to have time for meaning. The Magdalenian also marks a technical elegance unseen before. The spear thrower, or atlatl, evolved into a finely balanced extension of the arm, increasing range and power. One engraved piece found in the Vézère Valley depicts a beson in mid-turn, its muscles etched in exquisite realism, art meeting engineering. Some spear throwers were even decorated with relief carvings of animals, as if the hunter's tool itself carried the spirit of the prey. The boundaries between utility and beauty blurred. Beyond Europe, similar transformations unfolded across other continents. In East Asia, the waning cold allowed forest expansion and richer biodiversity, inviting humans to exploit new ecosystems. In northern China, hunter-fisher communities began crafting new microlithic tools adapted for smaller prey and fishing along thawing rivers. In North Africa, regions once parched began to green. Lakes that had shrunk during the glacial maximum refilled, and rock shelters in what is now Libya and Algeria show renewed human presence. Even in Australia, genetic and archaeological clues hint that coastal populations expanded inland again as rainfall returned to arid zones. Each of these shifts carried a quiet ecological consequence. As humans followed warmth, they also followed one another. Groups that had been separated by ice and drought for thousands of years began to meet again. Ideas flowed as readily as rivers, hunting techniques, decorative styles, symbolic motifs. In this way, climate change seeded cultural fusion long before written history ever did. And yet, for all its optimism, this moment was also delicate. The warming was uneven, the balance temporary. Glaciers still loomed on the horizon, their meltwaters feeding the vast rivers of the Rhine and the Seine, the Volga and the Danube. But for those who stood upon the reborn plains, the sense of possibility must have been overwhelming. To step northward into valleys no human had walked for centuries was to rediscover the planet itself. If you could stand there, 17,000 years ago, you might feel it. that strange collective breath of relief. The earth was waking, the ice was retreating. The people who had survived its tyranny were now writing a new story, one painted not in ash and despair, but in ochre and light. The first spring of the human world had begun. Imagine standing at the edge of a thawing world. It is 16,000 years ago, and the Earth is exhaling for the first time in tens of millennia. The ice that once defined horizons is pulling back. Meltwater rivers twist through valleys newly revealed, carving through soft moraine and whispering over ancient stones that have not felt the sun in thousands of years. The wind, once a weapon of the cold, now smells faintly of soil and wet grass. For the first time in living memory, the world hums not with survival, but with possibility. Across the continents, life begins to move again. Herds of reindeer, wild horses and bison migrate north along the retreating snow line. Mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses still roam, but the edges of their ranges shrink. Lions and bears follow the herds, while humans, those quiet, persistent survivors of the glacial night, walk behind, leaving new footprints on soft, thawing ground. They are not conquerors, not yet, but caretakers of a fragile new dawn. 16,000 years ago marks a cusp in both climate and consciousness. Global temperatures rise sharply compared to the long freeze that came before. Ice sheets over Europe and North America begin to recede, though they still cover millions of square kilometres. The world's sea levels, which had fallen more than 100 metres during the Last Glacial Maximum, start to climb, a slow and steady tide that will eventually redraw every coastline. Rivers swell with glacial runoff, great freshwater lakes form in the footprints of the ice. In this changing landscape, humans spread once more, not as scattered survivors, but as explorers of a reborn planet. Northern Europe, long a frozen wasteland, sees its first reoccupation. The Magdalenian descendants of the Ice Age artists move into valleys once buried under ice. To the east, groups adapted to cold steppe begin to follow the retreating tundra, reclaiming vast plains that will one day become forests. In the Americas, the descendants of those who lingered in Burinia start to trickle south and east as the glaciers open pathways, and in the Levant, in what's now Israel and Jordan, the earliest hints of something new appear. People beginning to stay longer in one place, building camps near lakes and rivers that will one day cradle agriculture. But here, at 16,000 years ago, the earth still belongs to the hunter, the gatherer, the wanderer. The air is cool, the night's long, but the light is shifting, gold where it was once blue. The Ice Age is not yet gone, but its rule is weakening, and humanity feels the change deep in its bones. At a lakeshore in the Levant, a group of foragers gathers wild barley and oats that have begun to grow more abundantly in the warming climate. They crush the grains on flat stones, leaving faint traces of starch that archaeologists will later find at sites like Ohalo 2. To them, it is not yet farming. It is simply a way to make the most of what nature now offers. But in this small act, grinding wild grass into flour, lies a foreshadowing of everything to come. This same fire that once cooked mammoth marrow now toasts the first crude flatbreads. In Europe, the caves that once offered refuge from bitter winds now stand as silent cathedrals of memory. The painted walls of Lascaux and Chauvet remain lit only by the eyes of bats and time. The artists who once danced light across those walls have moved on, their descendants chasing herds through open valleys. The caves, though, hold their story, a fossilized memory of beauty born from hardship. If one legacy of the Ice Age endures above all others, it is this, that creativity and survival were never separate. In the darkest ages they were one and the same. The Ice Age also left its mark not only in memory but in the very code of life. Modern genetics tells us that our DNA still carries the echoes of that frozen epoch, the adaptations that allowed some to endure long winters, to digest new foods, to resist ancient pathogens. Isolation in glacial refuges carved subtle distinctions between populations. The reunions that followed mixed them again. By 16,000 years ago, the great human lineages that would shape the Holocene world, European, Asian, African, and American, were already established, braided from thousands of years of separation and reconnection. Every cell in our bodies is a time capsule of Ice Age survival, and perhaps most profoundly, the Ice Age taught humanity how to remember. Around countless fires, in caves and on plains, stories became tools as vital as spears, preserving knowledge of migrations, seasons, and spirits. The myths of endurance born in that era would echo through oral traditions for millennia. In every later civilization, from the flood legends of Mesopotamia to the cold gods of the north, we can still hear the heartbeat of the Pleistocene, the memory of a world both merciless and magnificent. Picture then a band of hunters at the edge of a thawing marsh 16,000 years ago. The snow has retreated, leaving a glistening mosaic of reeds and meltwater pools. A child picks up a stone smoother than the others, a fragment shaped by the river's first rush of melt. The elders notice the returning geese, their migration long absent. One woman stirs embers by the fire, warming her hands and perhaps thinking, though she would not have words for it, that the world feels different this year. The cold no longer rules. The animals are fat again. The air smells of wet soil. The horizon looks less like an ending, more like a beginning. What the Ice Age leaves behind is not just changed landscapes or altered species, but a new kind of mind, the capacity for patience, the understanding of cycles, the ability to find meaning in endurance. It forged a species that could adapt not only to temperature but to time itself, to waiting out centuries of cold yet still imagining warmth. The skills we call civilization, planning, cooperation, innovation, were not born in cities, but in those frozen camps. The first engineers built bone shelters, not temples. The first artists painted herds, not kings. By 16,000 years ago, the world stands on the threshold of the Holocene. Forests are returning, coasts are creeping inward, and the long night of the Pleistocene is fading. But what remains of that age is everything that made us human. Our resilience, our memory, our fire. When we eventually sowed seeds and built walls, we did so with hands taught by millennia of survival in the cold. The Ice Age did not just precede civilization, it sculpted the minds that made it possible. So as the ice melts and rivers swell, as mammoths give their last calls across the tundra, and humans light their fires under warmer stars, the long experiment of endurance draws to a close. In the crucible of the Ice Age we became who we are. And as dawn rises over the thawing world, our ancestors step forward, carrying with them the warmth of everything they learned in the dark. And still, for all the change that stirred across the continents, the world of 16,000 years ago was far from peaceful. The ice might have begun its retreat, but its shadow lingered. Great torrents burst from melting glaciers, flooding valleys and swallowing plains. Winds carried fine glacial dust over thousands of kilometres, tinting sunsets pale gold and veiling the horizon in haze. The seas were still more than 100 metres below modern levels, revealing wide, barren shelves that stretched far beyond today's coasts. To those who walked there, the ocean must have seemed impossibly distant, a low blue line on the edge of the world. Every sound, every gust of wind echoed through open spaces too young to know the shape of trees. In those vast emptinesses, humans learned a new kind of awareness, not of threat but of scale. For the first time, entire continents lay open before them, unclothed by ice or forest. The concept of distance itself may have changed in the human mind. Paths that once led to nowhere now extended into lands freshly revealed. This was the era when migration no longer meant escape, but exploration. And in that shift, the human imagination found room to expand. We see its traces in the growing complexity of tools and ornaments, not just practical improvements, but subtle expressions of thought. A decorated grinding stone here, a shell pendant far inland there, each whispering that people had begun to connect landscapes in their minds long before they mapped them with their feet. The ice had taught them boundaries. The thaw taught them how to cross them. At the same time, ecosystems were reorganizing in ways that would quietly determine the future. Where the ice had receded, pioneer plants, mosses, sedges, and small flowering herbs colonized the raw soil. Behind them came shrubs, then birch and pine forests. This green wave rolled northward decade by decade, followed by animals and inevitably by people. The rhythms of the hunt changed. Instead of endless herds moving across frozen steppes, smaller and more localized game required patience, planning, and cooperation. Communities began to depend more on specific valleys, rivers, and lakes, learning their cycles intimately. The first long relationships between humans and particular places. Archaeologists studying late Pleistocene hearths find the fingerprints of these quieter revolutions. Charcoal layers show repeated burning of the same vegetation year after year, suggesting humans may have begun managing landscapes through fire, an early form of ecosystem engineering. Seeds from edible plants appear more frequently at habitation sites, not yet cultivated but selectively gathered. The idea of shaping nature rather than merely enduring it was stirring in the background like an idea half dreamed around a hearth. The Ice Age had not broken humanity, it had tempered it. Those who lived through its coldest centuries carried within them a deep adaptability, a mental toolkit as vital as their stone blades, and perhaps beneath the stars of that changing sky, some of them already sensed what was coming. Not the return of the cold, but something far stranger, a world of abundance, of permanence, of choice. Because when the ice finally withdrew and the earth began to green, humans stood ready, not as wanderers lost between seasons, but as keepers of memory. They had learned patience from glaciers, persistence from wind, and faith from fire. All the world that would follow, the sowing of fields, the building of temples, the writing of names, would be in a way the afterglow of that long winter's wisdom. The Ice Age may have ended, but it never really left us. It lives quietly in our endurance, in our imagination, and in that ancient instinct to adapt, survive, and begin again when the world changes.